This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour from Exclusive Scottish Visits, and welcome to my February 2024 Letter from Scotland, the Unique Scotland podcast that brings you the latest news from this wonderful country that puts the great into Britain. This newsletter gives you an insight into what makes this tiny country tick. It takes newsprint, TV and radio commentary and turns it into a bite-sized viewpoint from a local perspective with a slightly humorous edge. In today's Letter from Scotland, you will discover how Scotland's national dish, the haggis, could impact the forthcoming US presidential elections, and what has the tiny Hebridean village of TONG got to do with Donald Trump. I will also update you on a couple of political topics relating to my last newsletter, especially the juicy political scandals that seemed to be raging around Scotland at the time, and 2 years later are still ongoing. You will hear of the wee Scottish boy, only 2 years old, who climbed to Everest BAsgte Camp, and how did drug smugglers buy their way into Scotland in the 19th century. And in breaking news, I will let you know why the locals trembled in Scotland's birthplace of Christianity. Well, it's all here and much more. So sit back and enjoy your Letter from Scotland with John Harbour of Exclusive Scottish Visits on the Unique Scotland podcast. You heard it here first. Probably. The first question we've got to ask ourselves is, how could Scotland's national dish of haggis impact upon the US presidential election? And do Americans really want to eat haggis? Before I try to answer these questions, we have to look at the huge number of Scottish diaspora who are living in all countries around the world. It's estimated that between 30 and 40 million Scots descendants live outside Scotland, which itself only has a population of about 5.5 million. And some 6 million of these diaspora live in America. Now that is a considerable number of people voting for or against any potential president who tries to block the reintroduction of haggis to the United States. And the story starts in 1971, when President Richard Nixon banned the haggis under the Act of Prohibition, and all because the ingredients of this Scots delicacy included sheep's stomach. In actual fact, the sheep's stomach is only the receptacle of the delicious meal. Haggis used to be the poor man's food of the past. It was made by the peasants who used the leftovers from the tables of the dukes, the lairds and clan chiefs. Effectively, it's the offal from sheep. The recipe for haggis has not actually changed down the centuries, and it's simple to make in that you cut up sheep's liver, lungs and heart, add oatmeal, onion, suet and seasoning, and that's haggis. Okay, you've got to wrap the meal in something to cook it, and that's where the sheep's stomach comes in. It's a receptacle or a cooking bag, inside which you stuff the ingredients, then boil it until it's cooked. Then, when it's cooked, you cut open the bag and eat the contents, not the sheep's stomach. So, coming back to the original question, could the banning of haggis affect the US presidential elections? Well, you bet it could. If you could get 6 million American Scots haggis eaters on your side and vote for you, that could certainly swing the tide in your favour. So think about it, Mr. Biden, and the next Republican candidate. And as I transmit this podcast, there are 2 candidates left on the ballot, I believe, Mr. Trump and Miss Nikki Haley. So I think you should all give some consideration to agreeing to the importation of haggis. I mean, Rabbie Burns, that's the national poet of Scotland, the guy that wrote Auld Lang Syne, and My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, and whose birthday we celebrate on the 25th of January every year, would be turning in his grave if he knew that 6 million of his countrymen were prevented from eating their national dish in the land of the free. It was so important to Burns that he wrote a poem to it in the old Scots language, and it goes something like this. Fair fa your honest sonsy face, great chieftain o' the pudden race, aboon the ma ye tak your place, pain striper therm, wheeler ye worthy of a grace as lang's my arm. In other words, and in English this time, O Haggis, you have such an honest face, this best meat pudding in the world. Above them all, you take your place. You are very worthy of a prayer as long as my arm. So you get the sense that Robert Burns revered this dish. In reality, the next hopeful US president should take heed of the considerable influence this haggis could play in the elections. With 6 million Scots diaspora in America, you can see how important the haggis is to proud Scots. It's in your interest, I would humbly suggest, that you lift the ban on sheep stomach importation as soon as you can. As to whether or not present-day Americans would eat haggis, well, I can state categorically from a conclusive study that I have personally undertaken since I became a tourist guide with my touring company, Exclusive Scottish Visits, that almost every American client of mine has tasted it and would eat it again. And as I publish this letter from Scotland, it's my understanding that the Biden administration did lift the haggis ban in December 2021, on the proviso that sheep stomach is not used in the recipe, and some sort of synthetic wrapping is used to cook the meat inside. Well, I'm sorry, that is not a haggis. I'm not sure that sort of easing of the food regulations is enough to win over the hearts and minds of American Scots. But it is a start, so thank you, Mr. President. Oh, and may the best man or woman win the election this year. In my last letter from Scotland, I mentioned that the Scottish National Party and the ruling Scottish Government, in the opinion of some commentators, appeared to be playing games with the COVID pandemic, using it as a platform to further their separatist, i.e. independence, agenda. Of course, the pandemic's now over, well, certainly the original strain of the virus, but now the public inquiries have begun. Brian Monteith writes in the Scotsman newspaper, and he seems to have summed up the previous situation now that evidence given at the inquiry is bringing some interesting facts to the fore. He wrote recently the following. How can former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon look herself in the mirror and not see a bare-faced liar? Well, just to put that in context, the United Kingdom, which is made up of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, has one parliament with a Prime Minister in charge. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have devolved assemblies or local parliaments to govern on local matters pertaining to their own country. And the leader of that devolved administration is called the First Minister. Scotland's First Minister from 2014 to 2023 was Nicola Sturgeon, and that is whom Brian Monteith mentions. On 20th of June 2020, during the first year of the pandemic, Nicola Sturgeon said in answer to questions from BBC's Glenn Campbell at her daily briefing, I want to just come back to basics here. We're not dealing with politics at the moment. Frankly, anybody who is trotting out political or constitutional arguments during the pandemic is in the wrong place completely and has found themselves completely lost. This is just about what we need to do from a public health practical perspective to stop a virus. From comments yesterday, and that's the question from the media, it sounds as if we were dealing with something that was a constitutional argument, i.e. on furthering our goal of independence. That's nonsense, and we cannot see it like that, or we are letting down the people that we are here to serve in Scotland. Brian Monteith continues, what has come out of the present public inquiry is that on the very same day of that press conference, Sturgeon and her cabinet agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work on independence and a referendum, with the arguments reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis. And he goes on. Nicola Sturgeon told the Scottish people she was not trying to advance her constitutional and political policy for independence while dealing with COVID, that she was not seeking to use COVID as a means to develop that case, and were anyone to do so, they would be letting down the Scottish people. Yet that's exactly what she was agreeing to do on the same day she condemned such an abhorrent action. Mr. Monteith doesn't hold back when he then says, throughout the COVID pandemic, Nicola Sturgeon sought to make herself and her government look better than the UK government by doing things differently without any science or evidence-based justifications. In the end, the outcomes for the Scottish people were worse. Harsh words, Mr Monteith, and I have to declare here that Mr Monteith was a Scottish Member of Parliament for the opposition, but from what I've seen from the television viewing of this inquiry this week, there are some very serious issues being raised, and the Scottish Government does not come out of it smelling of roses. As a final part to this saga, the First Minister herself, Nicola Sturgeon, is not blameless. During the pandemic, she appeared to use her WhatsApp messaging system to communicate with her top team. Now, if that proves to be the case, then she should have kept those for the official record. But Miss Sturgeon has confirmed that she has deleted all her WhatsApp messages. Now, some people in Scotland look upon that action as quite serious, but to give the nationalist viewpoint, I'm going to quote Judith Duffy, senior political reporter of the Nationalist newspaper, and she wrote, "I am at a loss to understand the focus the COVID inquiry has chosen to adopt. Admittedly, the apparent emphasis has been skewed by highly selective and sensational reporting, but even allowing for this, it's clear that far too much time has been spent trying to hunt down and make sense of informal and transient thoughts expressed via WhatsApp. Well, as you'd expect from different ends of the political spectrum, different viewpoints. But I'm reminded of a phrase coined in 1887 by British Lord Acton, who said, 'Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.' And now, talking about monkey business, there has been some in the Highlands, as the authorities search for a Japanese macaque monkey called Honshu, who broke an electric fence and escaped from the Highland Wildlife Park near the small town of Kingussie. It's actually properly pronounced Kingussie. Instead of King Kong's escape, the locals are calling it Kingussie Kong's escape. There have been several sightings of the monkey, one at another local town, King Craig, where a local got the fright of her life when she looked out of her kitchen window to see this Japanese macaque pulling at her bird feeder. After eating some of the birdseed, the neighbour said she thought the monkey became a bit chirpy. Well, when challenged, the monkey jumped over the garden fence and headed into a local forest. The macaque remained free for a few nights until eventually some keepers from the wildlife park used drones and were able to track him down. He was lured into nets by the offer of a Yorkshire pudding, which is a north-east of England delicacy, and I don't blame the monkey, as I'd have thrown myself into a net for a Yorkshire pudding as well. Anyway, he was returned to his enclosure, where it's reported that he is doing well. In the middle of winter in the Highlands, life can be quite quiet and drab, so this little episode with Honshu the macaque has brought a little bit of fun and excitement to this part of the Highlands. And now news of a 2-year-old Scottish boy, Carter Dallas, who could be the youngest person ever to reach Everest BAsgte Camp, which, if true, is an amazing feat, albeit he did most of it on his father's back. Dad Ross and his mother Jade, both in their 30s, were on a year's vacation in South Asia, having rented out their house in Glasgow in August last year, 2023. The climb to Everest BAsgte Camp in Nepal is 17,598 feet above sea level. It certainly puts the height of mountains in Scotland in perspective when we boast the highest mountain in the United Kingdom, Ben Nevis, at 4,500 feet. Well, apparently when the family flight touched down in Kathmandu, they started the trek almost immediately, having bought the basics for their journey. George Mathias of the Scotsman newspaper of the 28th of January stated that Ross hoped to inspire other people to go out and see the real world. It would appear that Carter coped better than his father and mother, who both got altitude sickness, whereas Carter was fine. Ross the father said he believed they were well prepared for the trip as they regularly practiced breathing techniques and they all do cold ice bath plunges. Cold ice bath plunges, are you kidding? And that included Carter. Well, bless Carter and good luck with the ice bath plunges. You just need to dive into Loch Ness to experience that, if the truth be known. Well, if you know of anyone younger than Carter to complete the climb to the base camp, then please do get in touch. At the end of January, local people trembled in Scotland's birthplace of Christianity. That is the island of Iona, with St Columba's Iona Abbey in the centre. St Columba was a 6th century Irish monk who effectively evangelised Scotland, converting many pagans to Christianity. No, it wasn't some second coming of Columba or any other holy figure, but an earthquake. Yes, the island of Iona sits right next to the island of Mull, which experienced a 3.3 magnitude earthquake. According to some locals, they felt the earth shake and heard the sound of what they thought was low-flying aircraft passing by. Reports on social media channels reported sounds like a rumbling train, while others watched their crockery and pots and pans rattling in the dresser. What we've got to understand is that Scotland has 4 main fault lines running across the country, from northeast to southwest, and these are the Moyne Thrust, the Great Glen Fault, the Highland Boundary Fault, and the Southern Uplands Fault. The Great Glen runs from Inverness to Fort William, and Loch Ness sits on this line, so watch out next time you're actually taking a cruise on the loch. The Highland Boundary Fault line runs from Stonehaven in the northeast to Helensburgh, my old hometown as it happens, in the southwest, and on to the inner Hebridean islands such as the island of Mull. So this occurrence is not unusual, and the British Geological Survey reported, surprisingly, that Scotland gets about 300 tremors a year, but most are unnoticeable, with the most recent around Mull being considered moderate at 3.3 magnitude, which, of course, in comparison with the rest of the world's earthquakes, is very small. I suppose it's what you're doing at the time and where you are in the vicinity of an earthquake that dictates what you experience. And I have a first cousin on Mull, Margaret McLean, who lives in the tiny village of Benesson, with a super wee self-catering cottage, by the way, which you can rent, right by the sea. And she was totally surprised of talk of an earthquake. Now, in the following recording, she mentions a gentleman named Anders, who owns the Benesson Hotel, and he definitely heard the rumble and felt the tremors, and he lives less than half a mile from Margaret. Anyway, I gave her a call, and this is what she had to say. What was your experience of the earthquake, Maggie?
Nothing. We missed it.
Oh.
We missed it.
But you're on Mull. Did you not hear anything at all?
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm annoyed. We missed it. Anders felt it along the road. I don't know.
And at the Benesson Hotel?
He's just he lives along the road from us, John, you know.
And what did he feel?
Well, he felt the rumble, you know. He felt it.
Did he?
Where are you? What are you doing?
No, I'm just recording your voice because this is going on one of my podcasts.
Oh, no. I'm sorry, I can't help you. I wish I could give you something, you know, but it passed, John, and I didn't know anything about it till the next day.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing. So one part of the village, they felt it, the other part didn't.
I've been told it was like a lorry or a jet going past.
Yes,
you know?
And you never heard any. Well, that's good. So you're reporting from the island of Mull that all is well and that not many folk actually felt too much afterwards.
No.
Good.
No.
Righty-o.
I'm annoyed. I wish I could have felt it.
Well, bless my cousin Margaret, one of the few people in the world that gets annoyed because she didn't feel the earthquake. Well, her final words were effectively, the earth did not move for her. And all I could hear in the background was her husband Davy laughing away to himself. Thank you to Maggie and Davy from Benesson, the Isle of Mull, for that report. Of course, to get to the Isle of Mull, you have to take a ferry, either from the north of the island or the main route through Oban to Craignure. And it's ferries that I want to go on to discuss next, because a client of mine who visited Scotland in 2019 and who was interested in shipbuilding remarked upon the builder's yard at Port Glasgow near Greenock, where 2 ferries were being built at the Ferguson shipyard. I mentioned at the time that they were running around 2 years late, and he said, well, it'll take a lot more time to complete considering the relatively little amount of work that I could see. Well, at that time I didn't think much about it, but since then I've kept an eye on how the ferries progressed during the building stage. As it happens, when I lived in Helensburgh, which sits on the Clyde estuary, I could see Ferguson's builder's yard across the water, and with a pair of binoculars I could see the first ship, called Glen Sannox, up on the slipway. Anyway, to my dear friend who first pointed out the possibility of a problem with the building programme, you were quite right, because here we are in 2024, and the ships, yes there were 2 of them, have still not sailed. The reason I mention it now is because I've just seen a headline in the Scotsman newspaper of 2 days ago which reads, Ferries Fiasco Scotland, hugely delayed Glen Sannox to sail under own power for the first time. Well, it would appear that the ship will put to sea for sea trials on the 13th of February, in what the builders are calling an important milestone. I have to say, I had to have a chuckle to myself when I read that. Effectively, the ships are 6 years late. Yes, I'll repeat that, 6 years late. They are 3 times over budget, which means they've gone from an original price of 97 million to 300 million, and the final costs could rise again. It's incredible. And the company tell us that putting to sea for the first time is, I quote, an important milestone. A slight understatement, if I may say so. Of course, the obvious question is, what on earth happened? Well, I could take up this whole podcast as to how, allegedly, the Scottish National Government first awarded the contract against advice from professionals, how they nationalised the yard when it was going bust, how the company who won the contract became a preferred bidder against the odds when the other companies were cheaper, how documents were obtained by the winning company to give them an unfair advantage over competitors. But that could be slanderous, so I won't say that. However, I am going to introduce you to a wonderful Scottish word, shenanigans. Shenanigans. It means secret or dishonest activity and can be used in almost any circumstances to describe underhand dealing. You know the type of thing, for example, a second-hand car dealer selling cars where the mileage has been altered to make them look younger. Well, that would be shenanigans in the car dealership. Anyway, who am I to judge what's gone on with this ferry fiasco? If you're interested, however, to know more, you could look up or Google the BBC website and type in 10 things we learned about Scotland's ferry fiasco, and you'll get the full story. So thank you to my previous guests for pointing out the problem in 2019, and I just hope you're happy to see them sailing soon down the Clyde. There is a PS to this story, however, in that some of the equipment on board is now either out of date, out of warranty, or may not work because of the time it's taken to get the ships to sea. Does this mean more delays, more money? Perish the thought. Imagine, if you will, you're in the Highlands. There is nowhere else to stay, and you're invited into a stranger's house for the night, which is normal Highland hospitality. They give you dinner, wine, and you enjoy some conversation before you all retire for the night. When you're sure your hosts are asleep, you creep through the house, take out a broadsword, and start to kill the whole family, men, women, and children. Oh my God, I can hear you say, has John started writing crime thrillers? Well, as a matter of fact, I'm referring to an incident which actually took place on the 13th of February 1692. An estimated 30 members and associates of Clan MacDonald of Glencoe were killed by Scottish Government forces led by the Campbells, allegedly for failing to pledge allegiance to the new monarchs William III and Mary II. Yes, it was the famous Glencoe massacre, where a company of Scottish soldiers led by the Campbells were given traditional Highland hospitality by the MacDonald clan in the small village of Glencoe, not far from Fort William. In the middle of the night, the soldiers arose and started killing their hosts. It would appear that the MacDonald clan chief had missed the deadline to sign a document of allegiance to the new king and queen, and an order was given from Edinburgh for the whole clan to be slaughtered or put to the sword. Well, it may be a story of 330 years ago, but some sadness still does resonate down the centuries. Today, Glencoe has become a wonderful beauty spot with a very welcoming Glencoe Visitor Centre. Having driven down this valley, remember a glen is a narrow valley, well, having driven down this valley, with its towering mountains and sheer beauty, I can testify to the special place it is and has become. As you enter the glen, there's a car park right at the top, and sometimes I park there right opposite the Three Sisters Mountains, and some of my visitors have occasionally gone down into the valley to climb the peak directly opposite. In fact, if you look on my website, Exclusive Scottish Visits, on my homepage, there's 4 photographs together. Well, the photograph of a mountain is one of the Three Sisters. The glen was once home to hundreds of Highlanders, and you can get a flavour for how the MacDonalds of Glencoe lived in the reconstruction of a 17th century turf and creel house, which you can find at the mountain viewpoint just outside the visitor centre. I have to sympathise as I sit here in this modern centrally heated house with all the modern conveniences when I think of those poor Highlanders who eked out a living in their wee stone cottage with their turf roofs. And if you visit the new village of Glencoe today, there are a couple of pubs and restaurants, and you'll see some have notices and they all say, "Everyone welcome, except the Campbells." And talking about wee stone cottages with turf roofs, what has Donald Trump, ex-president of America, tycoon billionaire, got to do with these types of dwelling houses? And why is he such a supporter of Scotland? For the first answer, we have to go to the Outer Hebrides. And if you look at a map of the United Kingdom, at the top is Scotland, and to the west of the mainland Scotland, about 40 miles distant, is a large set of islands made up of Barra at the bottom and Lewis at the top, and these make up the Outer Hebrides. On the Isle of Lewis, you will find the tiny village of TONG, about 4 miles northeast of the major town Stornoway. In this tiny village was a croft house with a turf roof, where Mary Ann MacLeod was born in 1912, the youngest of 10 children. It was not uncommon for islanders to emigrate to America from the islands, whether through poverty, famine, or highland clearances, which moved people off the land to make way for sheep. Mary Ann MacLeod, at the age of 18, was one of these émigrés. She worked as a domestic servant and nanny in New York for a few years until, in 1936, she met and married Frederick Trump, and the union produced the man who would go on to be the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald Trump. Of course, we now know that Mr. Trump has invested considerably in the golfing world in Scotland, owning prestigious golf courses at Turnberry in Ayr and many in Aberdeenshire. Sadly, Mr. Trump had a turbulent relationship with the Scottish National Government, and the Scottish newspaper, The Herald, in 2022 reported that Nicola Sturgeon, who was First Minister at the time, urged Americans not to re-elect Donald Trump at any point. Of course, with recent scandals within the leadership of the Scottish National Party government, where £600,000 appears to have gone missing from party funds, and Nicola Sturgeon, her husband, and their accountant were arrested for questioning about allegations, then Mr. Trump must have rubbed his hands with glee. Miss Sturgeon, as it happens, resigned as First Minister just before her husband was arrested, and she categorically denies any wrongdoing and states that there was no connection between her resigning as the First Minister of Scotland and the arrest of her husband soon afterwards. Well, whatever the truth is, there does appear to have been some shenanigans, there's that word again, in the corridors of power in the Scottish Government. Anyway, Donald Trump appears to have had the last laugh because when she resigned, Mr. Trump apparently responded with, "Good riddance to failed woke extremist Nicola Sturgeon of Scotland." And that was me, by the way, doing an awful impersonation of Mr. Trump's voice. Well, I don't know about you, but I get the feeling that Mr. Trump and Miss Sturgeon won't be getting together socially for some time to come. Just how did drug smugglers and warmongers buy their way into Scotland in the 19th century? It was on one of my tours to Skye that I passed through the village of Plockton, and I recall doing some research on Duncraig Castle, but I skipped over the details at that time. However, a few days ago I noticed an article in the Scotsman newspaper by Alison Campsey that this Duncraig Castle, with a checkered history, starts new chapter as a holiday home. Now, whenever I see checkered history, it's always good to have a closer look to see what it means by checkered history. Something's wrong. Well, the checkered history relates to the original builder of the castle, who turns out to be Sir Alexander Matheson, a nephew of Sir James Matheson of Jardine and Matheson Company, which made its fortune from trading opium in Canton and Hong Kong. Indeed, the author Stan Neil, in his book on ethical branding and marketing, is quoted as saying, "Jardine and Matheson and Company quickly became infamous for smuggling opium from Britain's colonial possessions in India to China. The isolationist Qing Empire had outlawed these opium imports, but the lucrative trade was a significant source of income for the British Empire. As the largest Western opium smugglers, Jardine Matheson also maintained a complex publishing network and lobbied senior British politicians. So this wonderful old dilapidated castle is in new hands, and the new owners, Ian and Kate Beaton, will be investing hugely to turn it into a holiday home, and it has its own railway stop. Yes, you just put out your hand and the train will stop for you. The checkered history is now in the past, and in the past it shall remain. I just hope the garden hothouses don't get filled with cannabis plants. Oh, can't believe I've just said that. Final piece of news is a reflection on a lovely, talented man who has just passed, Charlie Allen. I used to listen to Charlie on BBC Radio 4, a brilliant programme by the way, who presented farming programmes. His obituary from the Scotsman newspaper of Friday 26th of January describes him as a man who excelled in a diverse range of activities, a top Highland Games athlete and an all-round sportsman, an academic, farmer, author, bothy ballad singer, composer and entertainer, publisher, broadcaster and champion of Doric. And Doric is a dialect spoken in the Aberdeenshire area. The thing that tickled me about Charlie was his sheer athleticism in the Highland Games ring, where his tossing the caber came into its own. The newspaper also reports on his other prowess of high jumping, and I quote, "Charlie was a World Caber Tossing Championship winner. He was also capable, despite his bulk, of a very decent high jump, often in his kilt, much to the delight and amusement of spectators at the Games. Well done, Charlie, for bringing smiles to our faces then and now. Rest in peace." Well folks, that is the end of this February edition of Letter from Scotland in my Unique Scotland podcast series. I'll be issuing this every 3 months, so you can look forward to the next issue in May. To ensure you get notification of this podcast, please go to my website Exclusive Scottish Visits on the podcast page and click on the email subscribe button to register. Of course, you can find me on all the normal podcast channels. And I do have a YouTube channel under Exclusive Scottish Visits, where you'll also find some of my touring videos. My next monthly touring podcast will be published on the 24th of February, and that's the first of my 3-part series on Edinburgh, where you'll join me on a tour of the old and new towns. You will learn about the characters who lived in Edinburgh, such as Deacon Brodie, gentleman by day and robber by night, and brought to light by Robert Louis Stevenson's book Jekyll and Hyde. You'll learn about the history. Why was a new town needed, and why, having been built in 1780, is it still called the New Town? And are there ghosts in the cemeteries and buried alleyways of old Edinburgh? So don't miss out and subscribe today. As always, I've thoroughly enjoyed bringing the snippets of news of Scotland to you, and I hope that through your connection to Scotland you can relate to some of the items discussed here. I always welcome feedback, so if you wish to comment on any of the issues raised, or if you wish me to cover any aspect of Scottish life, then please do get in touch through the contact page of my website, or send an email to info@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. But please don't forget that these snippets are commentaries only and do not necessarily reflect my own political leanings or bias or my opinions on any of the topics, and I can only apologise for any accents that I tried to impersonate. It's been a pleasure to have you all listening today, and I would now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising a glass to you, wherever you are in the world. Slàinte mhath.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.